Everyone thought the future of cars had already been decided. Batteries were winning. Charging networks were expanding. Tesla was leading the race. BYD was catching up fast. And almost every major car company on Earth was moving in the exact same direction. Bigger batteries, faster charging, longer range. That was the entire conversation. And then, in the middle of all that noise, Mazda did something that made the industry pause for a second. They brought back an engine most people thought was already dead. Not just any engine. The Rotary engine, an engine that had almost disappeared from modern cars because it was considered inefficient, unreliable, and outdated. Even some Mazda fans believed the company would never touch it again. But behind closed doors, Mazda engineers were working on something strange. They weren't trying to beat Tesla at building a better electric car. They were asking a completely different question. What if the problem was never the battery in the first place? And that question would slowly turn into something much bigger than anyone expected. Because while companies were spending billions building charging stations around the world, Mazda quietly started building a car that barely needed them. At first, nobody took it seriously. Mazda wasn't the biggest automaker. It wasn't dominating headlines like Tesla. It didn't have the scale of Toyota or Volkswagen. Most people saw Mazda as that smaller Japanese company making beautiful cars for loyal drivers. Reliable, smooth, fun to drive. But not exactly the company expected to challenge the future of transportation. But Mazda had always been different. The company started more than a century ago in Hiroshima, long before it ever built cars. Over the decades, it survived economic collapse, war, and brutal competition from larger manufacturers. And somehow, every time the industry moved in one direction, Mazda would move slightly against it. That became their identity. In the 1960s, when most companies avoided risky engineering experiments, Mazda doubled down on the rotary engine. It was compact, smooth, and unlike anything else on the road. Drivers loved the feeling. Engineers loved the simplicity. But there was a problem nobody could ignore. The engine burned too much fuel, created too much heat, and became difficult to justify in a world slowly moving toward efficiency. So eventually, the rotary disappeared. Or at least, that's what people thought. Because years later, when the EV revolution exploded, Mazda noticed something uncomfortable happening beneath the excitement. People loved electric cars. Until they had to live with them every day, charging anxiety became real. Long-distance travel became stressful. Apartment owners struggled to charge at home. Entire countries still lacked reliable charging infrastructure. And despite all the futuristic marketing, many drivers still quietly feared one thing: running out of power at the wrong moment. Most companies responded the same way. Build bigger batteries. Expand charging networks. Increase charging speed. But Mazda looked at the problem differently. Instead of asking how to charge faster, they asked something far more dangerous. What if drivers never had to think about charging at all? And this is where the story starts to get uncomfortable for the rest of the auto industry. Because Mazda didn't just revive the rotary engine, they completely changed its purpose. The old rotary used to power the wheels directly. The new one doesn't. Now the engine works almost like a hidden power generator, quietly sitting in the background, producing electricity while the electric motor handles the driving. The car still feels electric. Smooth acceleration, instant torque, near silence inside the cabin. But unlike a normal EV, the battery keeps getting recharged while you drive. No panic. Searching for charging stations? No. Waiting 40 minutes beside a highway charger? No. Constantly checking battery percentage during road trips, and the craziest part, most drivers wouldn't even notice when the engine turns on. Mazda engineered the system to work silently in the background, almost invisible to the driver. The rotary engine became smaller, lighter, and dramatically more efficient than before. Advanced cooling systems fixed the overheating problems that once damaged its reputation. New coatings reduced friction inside the engine. Fuel injection became incredibly precise. The engine that once symbolized inefficiency was suddenly becoming smart, and slowly, people inside the industry began paying attention. Because Mazda may have accidentally solved one of the biggest psychological problems electric vehicles still face. Not range itself, but the fear of range. That fear changes how people drive. It changes where they travel. It changes whether they trust the car at all. And Mazda realized something many companies ignored. Most people don't want to think about technology every time they drive. They just want the car to work. That simple idea started creating serious questions across the market, especially in regions where EV infrastructure still wasn't fully ready. In Europe, charging networks were growing, but gaps still existed outside major cities. In countries like India, millions of drivers still worried about charging access, electricity reliability, and long-distance practicality. But Mazda's system fit perfectly into those fears. You still got the smoothness of an electric car, but you also kept the freedom people were used to with petrol vehicles. That balance started making analysts nervous, because if customers suddenly preferred electric-like freedom over fully electric dependency, the entire EV market could shift direction, and the timing couldn't have been worse for companies heavily invested in pure battery platforms. Tesla built an empire around the idea that fully electric cars were the final destination. BYD invested billions expanding battery technology. Entire governments designed policies assuming the world would eventually become fully electric. But Mazda quietly introduced a terrifying possibility. What if the future becomes hybrid again, just smarter? And suddenly, reports started appearing that other companies were exploring similar range extender systems. Some automakers began accelerating hybrid research they had previously slowed down. Investors noticed the shift immediately. Even customers started asking different questions. Not which EV is fastest, but which car makes life easier. That subtle change in thinking may become the real turning point, because technology alone rarely wins markets. Convenience does. And Mazda understood something almost psychological about drivers. People don't actually care whether the power comes from batteries, fuel, hydrogen, or something else entirely. Most people only care about freedom. Freedom from stress. Freedom from inconvenience. Freedom from changing habits too aggressively. That's why this story matters more than just one engine. Mazda didn't try to beat Tesla by copying Tesla. Attacked the weakness nobody wanted to talk about openly. Dependence. And maybe that's why the industry reaction became so strange. Publicly, many companies still pushed fully electric messaging, but privately, hybrid systems suddenly became interesting again. Engineers began revisiting ideas they once abandoned. Even regulators started realizing the transition to pure EVs might take much longer than expected in many parts of the world. Meanwhile, Mazda kept moving quietly. No giant promises, no dramatic marketing, just a small company betting that the future might not belong to extremes. And maybe the most fascinating part is this: Mazda never claimed electric cars were bad. They simply asked whether people were truly ready for a world completely dependent on them. That's a very different question, because history shows something strange about technology revolutions. The companies that win are not always the first ones with the most advanced invention. Sometimes the winners are the companies that remove the most friction from everyday life. Smartphones didn't win because people loved processors. They won because they made life simpler, and now the car industry may be approaching the exact same moment. Not a battle between electric and petrol, but a battle between systems that demand adaptation and systems that quietly adapt to humans instead. Which means the real question is no longer whether EVs are the future. The real question is this: if a car can give people the feeling of an electric vehicle without forcing them to change the way they live, then what exactly happens to the companies that built their entire future around charging? The answer to that question could decide the next decade of the auto industry, because right now, something unusual is happening behind the scenes. The companies that once laughed at hybrid technology are quietly returning to it, not publicly, not aggressively, but slowly enough that most people haven't noticed yet, and Mazda may have triggered that shift without ever becoming the loudest company in the room. What makes this even more dangerous for the EV industry is that Mazda's system attacks the exact place where electric cars still feel fragile. Trust during uncertainty. Think about how people actually drive in real life. A fully electric car feels amazing in the city. Smooth, silent, fast. But the moment someone plans a long trip, whether changes or charging stations become crowded, a small amount of stress appears in the background, even if the battery is technically enough. The driver starts calculating everything: distance, traffic, temperature, charging availability, battery percentage. That mental pressure changes behavior more than companies admit. Mazda understood that people don't only buy transportation, they buy peace of mind. So instead of building the biggest battery possible,